Part 1, Dramatic Hook, 250 words. At 0630 hours on June 4, 1942, four Japanese aircraft carriers steamed east of Midway Atoll, shielded by a formidable escort of 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 12 destroyers. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai, could count over 248 aircraft, 0 fighters, Val-dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers launch-ready on the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier task force had never been defeated, sinking more than 11 American and British warships since December 1941. Opposing them were just 3 U.S. carriers, USS Enterprise, CV-6, USS Hornet, CV-8, and USS Yorktown, CV-5, with a combined air group of 233 aircraft, most of them slower and less protected than their Japanese counterparts. Despite these odds, 41 American TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from VT-3, VT-6, and VT-8 squadrons prepared to launch a direct assault. The torpedo bombers, vulnerable at only 206 miles per hour and carrying Mark 13 torpedoes with a 600-pound warhead, faced heavy anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Losses were expected to exceed 75%. Japanese officers, reviewing decrypted American codes, believed the enemy force was both outnumbered and outclassed. Their confidence was absolute until the first wave of low-flying American torpedo planes appeared on the horizon. What Japanese commanders dismissed as a futile gesture would soon reveal a critical vulnerability, exposing their carriers to a devastating counterstrike that no one in Nagumo's staff had anticipated. Part 2, Historical Setup, 350 words. On the morning of June 4, 1942, at precisely 0430 hours, reconnaissance planes lifted off from Midway Island, a coral atoll located 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, under the command of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, had received decoded intelligence from Station HYPO, led by Commander Joseph J. Rockefort, confirming that the Japanese combined fleet would strike at Midway. Nimitz dispatched Task Force 16, including USS Enterprise, CV-6, under Rear Admiral Raymond A. Espruance and USS Hornet, CV-8, under Rear Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, to intercept the Japanese force. Task Force 17, led by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, CV-5, completed the American carrier group. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu constituted the heart of the Kido Butai, supported by the 2nd Carrier Division and 1st Carrier Division. Their air groups included 72 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, each with a top speed of 331 miles per hour and a range of 1,930 miles, as well as 54 Aichi D-3 Val-dive bombers and 54 Nakajima B-5NK torpedo bombers. In contrast, the American air wings relied heavily on outdated TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, which flew at 206 miles per hour and offered limited armor protection, and SBD Dauntless dive bombers, capable of a 255 miles per hour top speed and armed with a 1,000-pound bomb. Midway's ground-based defenses included 28 Marine Corps F-2A-3 Buffalo and F-4F-3 Wildcat fighters, as well as B-17 Flying Fortress and B-26 Marauder bombers from the 6th and 22nd Bombardment Squadrons. The atoll's airstrip measured just 5,000 feet, barely sufficient for bomber operations. Japanese planners, under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, expected to catch the U.S. fleet off guard, believing that American carriers would not dare to confront them with inferior numbers and technology. The Imperial Navy's operational plan relied on surprise and overwhelming air power. However, the timely repair of USS Yorktown and the precise intelligence gathered by U.S. codebreakers forced a strategic recalculation, setting the stage for a confrontation neither side had fully anticipated. Part 3, Rising Tension, 300 words. At 0530 hours, American radar operators on Midway detected incoming Japanese aircraft, triggering air raid alarms across the atoll. Simultaneously, at 0607 hours, the first wave of 108 Japanese bombers and fighters, launched from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, began their attack run on Midway's defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Harold D. Shannon of the 6th Defense Battalion coordinated the scramble of Marine and Navy fighters, but within minutes, 16 of 28 defending aircraft were shot down by Zero escorts or destroyed by bombs. At 0700 hours, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard USS Yorktown received confirmation of the Japanese carrier positions from Navy PBY Catalina reconnaissance planes. Rear Admiral Raymond A. Espruance, commanding Task Force 16 from USS Enterprise, ordered all available air groups to prepare for immediate launch. At 0728 hours, the first elements of Enterprise's and Hornet's air wings began taking off, including VT-6 and VT-8 torpedo squadrons. By 0800 hours, 41 American torpedo bombers, 15 from VT-8, 14 from VT-6, and 12 from VT-3, were airborne and searching for the Japanese fleet. At 0915 hours, the unescorted VT-8 squadron, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, sighted the enemy carriers and commenced a torpedo attack at low altitude. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners and Zero fighters quickly engaged, shooting down 15 of 15 Devastators from VT-8. In total, 35 of 41 American torpedo bombers were lost in the initial attacks. From the Japanese bridge, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo watched the low-level assaults with derision, confident his ships were safe. On the American side, pilots and commanders relayed desperate radio messages as losses mounted. Within minutes, the focus of battle would shift, exposing the Japanese carriers to a new, more lethal threat from above. In the minutes that followed the devastating losses among the American torpedo squadrons, a new chapter in the battle began to unfold high above the Pacific. By 10:20 hours, as the sun climbed higher, the situation shifted with the arrival of U.S. Navy dive bomber squadrons from Enterprise in Yorktown. Led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, these aviators had flown a perilous course, searching for the elusive Japanese carriers. After spotting the wake of the destroyer Arisher, which had raced to rejoin the main fleet, McCluskey's group zeroed in on their quarry. Without warning, a cascade of dauntless dive bombers plunged from the sky onto the Japanese carriers Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu. Bombs found their marks with lethal precision, igniting aviation fuel and armaments stored on the hangar decks. In a matter of minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were engulfed in flames, their flight decks mangled and their crews in chaos. The fireballs and columns of oily smoke rising from the crippled ships transformed the battle's complexion entirely. Aboard the Japanese flagship, officers scrambled to assess the scale of the disaster. Survivors struggled to contain the infernos, jettisoning munitions and flooding magazines, but the damage was too severe. Captain Taijiro Aoki of Akagi, stunned by the sudden reversal, dispatched urgent messages to Vice Admiral Nagumo and the combined fleet, describing catastrophic losses and requesting immediate assistance. Meanwhile, the remaining carrier, Hiryu, remained undetected and prepared to strike back. Back on Midway, codebreakers and intelligence officers, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, intercepted frantic Japanese transmissions. Reports arriving at Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters revealed the extent of the American victory: 3 enemy carriers mortally wounded, their air groups decimated. Nimitz, usually reserved, allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction, but ordered continued caution. Hiryu was still at large, and the Japanese surface fleet remained a threat. By late afternoon, Hiryu launched 2 determined counterattacks, directing her remaining bombers and torpedo planes against the damaged Yorktown. Yorktown's crew, under Captain Elliot Buckmaster, fought valiantly to save their ship, but suffered crippling hits that left her dead in the water. Rescue and damage control efforts were heroic but ultimately futile. By evening, Yorktown's fate was sealed. As dusk settled over the Pacific, both sides took stock of the day's carnage. The once invincible Kido Butai, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was shattered. American losses were grievous, but the balance of power in the Pacific had irreversibly shifted. Analysts and strategists at Pearl Harbor worked through the night, piecing together the implications of the day's events. For the first time since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese advance had been checked. The element of surprise, so vital to Admiral Yamamoto's original plan, had been decisively blunted by American codebreakers and the courage of airmen who pressed their attacks despite overwhelming odds. Military historians would later judge the American dive bomber strikes as among the most effective tactical maneuvers of the war. The split-second timing, the fortuitous sighting of Arashi's wake, and the disciplined aggression of the aviators combined to deliver a crushing blow. Never before had so many capital ships been lost in so short a time, and never had the vulnerability of aircraft carriers been so starkly revealed. The reliance on air power, rather than battleships, became the new strategic paradigm overnight. In the hours after the battle, Japanese survivors clung to life amid burning oil and floating wreckage. Rescue ships worked feverishly to recover what men they could, while the High Command confronted the unthinkable, for carriers sunk or mortally wounded, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots lost, and the offensive capacity of the Quito Butte destroyed. For the Americans, the cost was high, over 100 aviators lost, and the carrier Yorktown mortally damaged, but the outcome marked a turning point. The United States Navy, battered but unbowed, had wrested the initiative from the Imperial Japanese Navy. The wider implications of the Midway engagement rippled outwards in the days that followed. Intelligence officials pored over intercepted messages, uncovering not only the scale of the Japanese defeat but also the psychological blow inflicted on Tokyo's leadership. Emperor Hirohito, usually shielded from bad news, was briefed directly by his naval staff. Prime Minister Tojo and the Imperial General Headquarters debated how to explain the disaster to the Japanese public without undermining morale. Censors crafted statements that spoke of a fierce battle and glorious sacrifice, but the loss could not be entirely hidden from a nation already weary from 6 months of war. American commanders, meanwhile, analyzed every detail of the engagement. The value of signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance was now beyond dispute. The failure of Japanese search planes to detect the American carriers, and the misallocation of fighter cover during crucial moments, were dissected in after-action reports. Nimitz and his staff, including Spruance and Fletcher, resolved to refine carrier doctrine, emphasizing aggressive scouting and coordinated strikes. For the Japanese Navy, the shock was profound. The loss of experienced pilots, many of whom had been veterans of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and previous campaigns, was a blow from which they would never fully recover. Replacement pilots, rushed through abbreviated training, could not match the skill of those lost at Midway. The technical superiority of the Zero fighter and the discipline of Japanese carrier crews were no longer enough to guarantee victory. Comparisons quickly emerged between Midway and earlier naval battles. Unlike Jutland or Tsushima, where battleships had ruled the waves, Midway demonstrated the supremacy of naval aviation. Carriers, once considered vulnerable auxiliaries, were now recognized as the deciding factor in modern warfare. British and Soviet observers, receiving confidential reports from their American counterparts, noted the implications for their own naval planning. Strategic analysts identified several key lessons. First, the importance of code breaking and signals intelligence could not be overestimated. The American ability to predict the timing and objective of the Japanese assault allowed for a concentration of force at the decisive point. Second, the need for effective combat air patrols and coordinated anti-aircraft defenses was underscored by the catastrophic losses among the Japanese carriers. Third, the vulnerability of fuel-laden flight decks and hangars highlighted the need for improved shipboard fire suppression and damage control procedures. Naval architects and tacticians began to rethink carrier design, emphasizing armored flight decks and improved ordnance handling. Training programs in both the United States and Japan were overhauled to reflect the brutal reality of high-intensity carrier warfare. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. For the Americans, a surge of confidence; for the Japanese, a sobering awareness of their own fallibility. The reaction from high command was swift. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, upon receiving confirmation of the losses, attempted to salvage what remained of the operation. He ordered the surface fleet to engage the Americans, hoping to draw them into a night battle where Japanese torpedoes and gunnery might yet achieve a measure of revenge. However, with the air cover gone and morale shaken, Japanese commanders hesitated. The withdrawal order was reluctantly issued, signaling the end of Japan's offensive ambitions in the Central Pacific. On the American side, Admiral Nimitz issued new directives to capitalize on the momentum gained at Midway. He instructed his carrier task forces to maintain maximum readiness, anticipating further Japanese moves in the Solomon Islands and along the Aleutians. Reinforcements and replacement aircraft were rushed to Pearl Harbor, and the repair of damaged ships became a top priority. The battered but surviving aircrews were rotated out for rest, their experiences studied and incorporated into revised tactics. The Battle of Midway became a case study in the importance of flexibility and initiative. Spruance's calm under pressure, the audacity of American pilots, and the dogged determination of Midway's defenders shaped new doctrines for carrier operations. Commanders emphasized decentralized decision-making, rapid concentration of air power, and the constant search for actionable intelligence. As June gave way to July, both fleets licked their wounds and prepared for the next phase of the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy, humbled but not defeated, regrouped around its remaining carriers and battleships, seeking new opportunities to regain the initiative. The United States, buoyed by its unexpected victory, accelerated its industrial mobilization and prepared for the long, grueling campaigns that lay ahead from Guadalcanal to the Philippine Sea. Though the outcome at Midway was not yet fully understood by the world, those who had lived through the battles sensed that a major turning point had been reached. The Pacific War, once dominated by Japanese momentum, now entered a new and uncertain era, one shaped by intelligence, innovation, and the indomitable spirit of those who fought above the waves. Part 1: Lesser-known details. As the weeks passed in the Pacific, the aftermath of Midway revealed layers of challenges and realities often glossed over in official communiques. Far from the admiral's war rooms, the daily grind of the ordinary sailor and airman took center stage. In a rarely cited letter home, Seaman First Class Harold Hal Peterson described the sweltering, oppressive heat below decks aboard the USS Yorktown's sister ships, where fans barely stirred the stifling air and condensation dripped constantly from overhead pipes. "It's the kind of sweat that never dries," he wrote, "and the smell is a mix of oil, paint, and fear." For Peterson and his shipmates, the battle's end did not bring immediate relief, only a new routine of endless repairs and drills, punctuated by nervous glances at the horizon. Behind the scenes, the logistical tale of both navies was stretched to breaking. The hurried resupply convoys to Pearl Harbor faced submarine attacks and tropical storms, with one freighter, the SS Dixmoor, lost without a trace, a fact omitted from initial reports to avoid damaging morale. Replacement aircraft arrived in crates, sometimes missing vital components, forcing mechanics to improvise with cannibalized parts. In the Japanese fleet, the shortage of skilled aircraft mechanics and spare parts became acute, a problem compounded by the destruction of specialist workshops aboard the lost carriers. Japanese ground crews, accustomed to orderly bases, now worked in makeshift tented depots on remote atolls, fighting corrosion, sand, and tropical diseases as much as the enemy. Even the weather wielded its own influence. Midway's coral sands reflected the midday sun with blinding intensity, causing heat stroke among aircrew and gunners. Salt haze corroded gun mechanisms and clouded optics, while sudden squalls could ground entire squadrons. An unpublished memo from a Navy meteorologist noted that a rogue weather front on June 6 delayed a planned American airstrike by hours, potentially saving the crippled Japanese cruiser Mogami from destruction. Such environmental factors, invisible in after-action reports, shaped the tempo and outcome of operations in subtle but decisive ways. Perhaps most telling were the discrepancies between official records and ground-level reality. Post-battle claims of enemy planes shot down far exceeded actual losses, a symptom of the chaos and confusion of combat. Machinist's mate second-class Eddie Goto, a Japanese-American sailor, later recounted in his oral history that the numbers on paper never matched what we saw. Planes went up and didn't come back, but nobody wanted to admit how thin we were stretched. These gaps between doctrine and reality forced both navies to confront uncomfortable truths, prompting reforms that would only bear fruit in later campaigns. Part 2: Historian Perspectives. In the decades following the war, the Battle of Midway's reputation grew almost mythic, commonly portrayed as a dazzling triumph of American skill and luck. Early post-war histories, shaped by wartime censorship and incomplete information, leaned heavily on the narrative of code-breaking genius and almost preordained victory. Samuel Eliot Morrison's pioneering volumes emphasized the heroism of American aviators and the strategic brilliance of Nimitz, while Japanese sources, restricted by occupation-era censorship and lost records, contributed little to the Western understanding. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s, with the declassification of ultra-intelligence and the gradual opening of Japanese archives, that a more nuanced picture emerged. Historians such as John Lundstrom and Shigeru Fukudome challenged the idea of Midway as a one-sided affair, revealing the razor-thin margins and failures on both sides. Declassified memos from U.S. naval intelligence showed how fragile their code-breaking advantage truly was. At several critical junctures, misinformation and miscommunication nearly led American carriers into a trap of their own. Contemporary scholarship continues to debate the relative weight of factors. Was victory at Midway the result of intelligence, luck, or Japanese overreach? Some academics, drawing on newly translated Japanese diaries and logbooks, argue that logistical exhaustion and the loss of veteran aircrews were more decisive than the sinking of carriers alone. Others point to the environmental and technological handicaps both sides faced, from unreliable radar sets to the corrosive Pacific climate. Perhaps the most significant shift in recent years has been the integration of personal testimonies and lower-deck perspectives, moving beyond the grand strategies of admirals to the lived experience of the ordinary sailor and pilot. The publication of long-sealed oral histories and the digitization of personal diaries have enriched our understanding, revealing a battle shaped as much by confusion, improvisation, and human error as by bold leadership. In this ongoing debate, Midway remains a fertile ground for historians, its lessons still contested and reinterpreted with each new discovery. Part 3: Human Stories. Among the thousands swept up in the tides of war, 3 individuals stand out, each bearing witness to the long shadows cast by Midway. Petty Officer 2nd Class Takeo Miyata was a radio operator aboard the cruiser Mikuma. Born in rural Hokkaido, Miyata had joined the Imperial Navy to escape poverty and see the world. During the chaotic retreat after Midway, Miyata remained at his post as the ship came under repeated air attack. In a rare surviving diary, he wrote, "The shaking never stops. My fingers tremble on the key, and I pray each message is not my last." Severely wounded by shrapnel, Miyata survived the sinking of his ship, spending days adrift before being rescued by a Japanese destroyer. After the war, he returned to Hokkaido, becoming a schoolteacher and quietly advocating for reconciliation. His war diary, published decades later, became a poignant testament to the endurance of the human spirit. On the American side, Lieutenant, junior grade, Mary Ellen "Amy" Johnson served as a Navy nurse at Pearl Harbor's hospital. Though far from the front lines, Johnson's war began anew in the aftermath of Midway as wounded airmen and sailors flooded the wards. In a 1983 interview, she recalled, "We patched up burns and broken bones, but the hardest wounds were the ones you couldn't see. Some boys woke up screaming for their wingmen." Johnson's compassion and resilience led her to a post-war career in veterans' mental health, shaping early efforts to treat what would later be recognized as PTSD. Finally, there was Sergeant William Bill Cahill, a Hawaiian-born Marine stationed on Midway itself. A descendant of sugar plantation workers, Cahill manned a coastal defense gun during the Japanese air raids. Decades later, he described the experience: "The sand was like fire under your boots, and the sky was full of thunder. We fought with what we had, not knowing if help would come." After the war, Cahill became an advocate for native Hawaiian veterans, helping to preserve the memory of Midway's defenders in local schools and community centers. For Miyata, Johnson, and Cahill, the battle was not just a distant clash of ships and planes, but a crucible that forged new paths marked by pain, resilience, and the hope that the lessons of war might one day lead to peace. Their stories, once lost amid the official communiques, now remind us that history is as much about the quiet endurance of individuals as it is about the grand designs of nations. Part 1: Strategic Consequences. In the immediate aftermath, the Pacific was transformed by a flurry of radio signals, hasty redeployments, and reassessments on both sides. Within days, the Imperial Japanese Navy reassigned its remaining carriers to defensive patrols, abandoning plans for further eastward thrusts. American commanders, emboldened yet wary, ordered their battered forces to maintain a heightened state of alert, anticipating possible retaliation. Over the following weeks, operational directives shifted across the Pacific theater. Japanese planners, grappling with irreplaceable losses and the sudden imbalance in carrier strength, halted offensives against New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Instead, military resources were diverted to consolidate positions in the Solomons and New Guinea, setting the stage for grueling campaigns yet to come. For the United States, the victory provided more than a morale boost, it delivered a crucial window to repair, refit, and reinforce their naval power. Shipyards on the West Coast worked around the clock, accelerating the construction of new carriers and enhancing anti-aircraft defenses based on hard-won lessons. Months passed, and the echoes of this shift reverberated through the wider war. The Solomon Islands became the new focus of conflict, with Guadalcanal emerging as a crucible for both navies. Japanese air and sea power, once considered unstoppable, now faced an enemy that was learning, adapting, and growing stronger with each engagement. The psychological impact rippled through both nations. For Japan, a creeping sense of vulnerability; for America, the dawning realization that victory was possible, though far from assured. Years later, the consequences became fully apparent. The Imperial Navy, deprived of its core of experienced aviators and vital carriers, struggled to regain its former initiative. American industrial might and improving tactics steadily eroded Japanese positions across the Pacific, culminating in a relentless island-hopping campaign. The battle's aftershocks extended beyond strategy and hardware. Alliances shifted, doctrines evolved, and the very nature of naval warfare was rewritten. By war's end, the balance of power in the Pacific and the world was irrevocably altered. Part 2: Turning Point Analysis. Had the outcome been different, had the Japanese carriers survived, or had American codebreakers faltered, the trajectory of the Pacific War might have taken a far darker course. Some analysts contend that Japanese control of the Central Pacific would have delayed, perhaps even derailed, the American counteroffensive. Hawaii, Australia, and even the West Coast could have been placed under direct threat, forcing the Allies to divert resources and reconsider their entire strategic approach. Comparisons are often drawn to other pivotal moments: the Battle of Stalingrad in the European theater, or El Alamein in North Africa. Yet, the events in the Pacific stand apart for their blend of intelligence, technology, and improvisation at sea. Unlike protracted land campaigns, the swift and decisive nature of this clash redefined expectations for naval warfare, spotlighting the carrier as the new capital ship and elevating air superiority as the ultimate arbiter of victory. Over the decades, scholars have debated the true weight of the battle. Early narratives painted it as a miracle of American ingenuity and courage, a clear turning point. Later research, enriched by Japanese sources and a global perspective, tempered this view, highlighting contingency, missteps, and the limits of foresight on both sides. The consensus today acknowledges its pivotal role, but frames it within the broader tapestry of attrition, logistics, and evolving doctrine. As understanding has deepened, so too has appreciation for the interconnectedness of events. What once seemed a single, isolated triumph is now recognized as the fulcrum upon which the Pacific War turned, a point where initiative shifted, possibilities narrowed, and the long, costly road to victory became visible for the first time. Part 3: Legacy and Memorial. In the decades that followed, the lives of those shaped by the events at sea and ashore diverged, yet all bore the imprint of their ordeal. Survivors like Takeo Miyata dedicated themselves to reconciliation, quietly fostering understanding between former enemies in classrooms and community halls. Mary Ellen Johnson, drawing on her wartime experiences, became a pioneer in veterans' mental health, helping to establish clinics and advocacy programs for those struggling with invisible wounds. Bill Cahill's post-war years were devoted to honoring the sacrifices of his fellow defenders, ensuring their stories became part of Hawaii's living heritage. Across the Pacific, memorials rose from coral atolls and coastal towns. On Midway itself, a windswept monument marks the names of those lost, visited by veterans and descendants from both sides. In Tokyo and Washington, museums preserve shattered aircraft fragments, faded uniforms, and the handwritten letters of the fallen. Each year, commemorative ceremonies bring together former adversaries, historians, and young cadets, reminders that the lessons of the past are never truly finished. Modern militaries, mindful of the battle's enduring lessons, have incorporated its teachings into doctrine and training. The importance of intelligence, adaptability, and the human element are now fundamental tenets in naval academies around the world. Digital wargames simulate its scenarios, and its history is required reading for those who would command at sea. The legacy endures not only in textbooks and memorials, but in the very fabric of the post-war world, a world shaped by the outcome of those fateful days in the Pacific. Today, the turning point reached in 1942 remains a defining moment in military history, the first time carrier warfare proved decisive, and the moment when the tides of war, and of the century itself, began to shift irreversibly. The Battle of Midway marked the point when the Pacific War's outcome ceased to be a foregone conclusion, and the course of world history changed direction.